The tanker had gone sideways at half, past 2 in the afternoon. Not into the river exactly, not yet. It had slid off the edge of the approach bank at the Brenner Ford and come to rest at an angle, its front axle in the water, its rear wheels still on the bank but sinking slowly into the saturated ground that the 3 days of rain had made of everything within 20 meters of the Ammer River. The driver had gotten out through the passenger window, standing on the door frame above the current, and had been helped to the bank by the 2 firemen who arrived first. He was unhurt, the tanker was not. 22,000 liters of heating fuel, the winter supply for the villages on the far side of the valley. The tanker weighed 31 tons fully loaded, and it was fully loaded, and the river was rising at a rate that the district flood officer had described that morning as significant and that the afternoon's rain had made urgent. Hans Richter arrived at 3:30 with the district flood rescue unit, 2 heavy recovery vehicles, a crane truck, and 6 men in orange waterproof gear. He had been running flood operations in this district since 1958 and had recovered more vehicles from flood situations than he could readily count. He stepped out of the lead vehicle, looked at the tanker, looked at the river, looked at the bank, and began issuing instructions. By 5 o'clock, he had issued a great many instructions. The crane truck had attempted to position itself on the bank to the east and had sunk its rear outriggers into the waterlogged ground on the second attempt. The heavy recovery vehicle had approached from the bridge approach road, gotten close enough to attach a cable, and then the driver had felt his own rear end beginning to slide toward the water and disengaged. The second recovery vehicle had not attempted the bank at all, its driver having watched the first 2 and formed his own assessment. Richter stood at the edge of the firm ground and looked at the tanker, which had moved 6 centimeters further into the river in the 2.5 hours since his arrival. He looked at the water, still rising, still carrying branches and debris. He picked up the radio and called the district office. He said that the vehicle was in a position from which safe recovery was not possible with the equipment he had available, that the bank conditions were deteriorating, and that, in his professional assessment, the tanker would need to be abandoned until the river level dropped. He had been saying the right things all afternoon. He had simply been saying them to the wrong situation. If this is your first story on this channel, subscribe now and hit the bell. New story every single day, and this one is just getting started. Let me tell you about the Brenner Ford and about what it meant to the valley, because the stakes of this afternoon were not only about the tanker. The Ammer Valley southeast of Weilheim had been farming country since the Middle Ages. The Brenner Ford was the oldest river crossing in the district, not a bridge, which the valley had acquired only in 1923, but a crossing point where the river's bedrock came close enough to the surface to allow passage in ordinary conditions. Before the bridge, the ford had been the crossing. After the bridge, the ford had become the alternative when the bridge was occasionally impassable, and the approach track to it had remained in use because farmers on both sides maintained it as a matter of practical necessity. The tanker had used the ford approach track because the bridge was partially blocked by a fallen elm from Tuesday's storm, and the repair crew had not yet arrived. The 22,000 liters of heating oil were scheduled for delivery to 4 farms and the village cooperative store at Unterfeld, on the far side of the valley. Unterfeld was a village of 180 people whose farms, including 3 dairy operations, required heating through the winter months for the cattle as well as the houses. Without the autumn delivery, the farms would be managing on reserve supplies within 6 weeks, and the village cooperative would exhaust its stock by January. None of this was immediately apparent to Hans Richter, who knew flooding and knew recovery operations, but did not particularly know the valley or what moved through it in October. Georg Steiner knew. Georg Steiner was 64 years old and had farmed the land on the eastern bank of the Ammer since 1938, when he had taken over the farm from his father at the age of 17. He had been watching the ford crossing for 40 years the way farmers watch everything that affects their land, with the steady, accumulated attention that produces understanding rather than information. He knew the ford in dry summer conditions and in the spring melt and in the autumn floods. He knew where the bedrock was and where it was not. He knew which parts of the approach bank were underlaid with gravel and which were underlaid with clay. He knew, specifically, that the area where Richter's crane truck had sunk its outriggers was underlaid with a thick layer of alluvial clay that absorbed water like a sponge and would not support heavy equipment in flood conditions. He had known this since 1947, when his own wagon had gotten stuck in the same clay on a wet October afternoon that in some respects was not unlike this one. He had been watching from his barn since the tanker had gone in. He had seen the crane truck attempt and fail. He had seen the recovery vehicle approach and retreat. He had gone to the barn and looked at the Lanz for a while. Then he had drunk a cup of coffee while the rain came down on the yard outside. Then he had walked back to the barn and started the preparations. Hans Richter saw the headlight of the old tractor coming along the riverbank, track from the direction of the eastern farm at about 5:30. He watched it approach with the attention a professional man pays to unexpected elements in a situation he is managing. When it came close enough for him to see what it was, he exhaled through his nose in a specific way. A Lanz Bulldog. Old. The single headlight, the narrow front, the wide rear tires, the single exhaust pipe, moving at a walking pace along the bank, finding its way between the old willow trees and the edge of the waterlogged ground with the unhurried confidence of something that had been on this bank before. Georg Steiner brought the Lanz to a stop on the firm gravel ridge, the one that ran along the eastern bank for 40 meters before disappearing into the clay, and climbed down. He stood looking at the tanker for a moment. Then he walked to where Richter was standing. Steiner, Richter said. He knew the man from the valley. I know this bank, Georg said. The gravel runs east from the old willow for 30 meters, stays above 60 centimeters deep all the way to the ford approach. Your equipment went on the clay north of the willow. He looked at the tanker. From the gravel ridge I can get a direct line to the tanker's front axle, diagonal pull toward the east bank. The driver can take it from there once the front axle finds the gravel. Richter looked at him. He looked at the Lanz. He looked at his equipment, which was sitting on the clay bank being unable to do anything useful. He looked at the tanker, which had moved another 2 or 3 centimeters into the river while they had been standing there. That machine, he said, has perhaps 35 horsepower. The tanker weighs 31 tons. I do not need to move it far, Georg said. I need to move it 2 meters east. Once the front axle is on the gravel, the driver takes it. One of the rescue team members, a younger man standing behind Richter, said something under his breath. The man beside him smiled. The younger man's expression said, "This does not require serious discussion." Richter looked at Georg for a long moment. He looked at the water. He looked at the tanker. How long, he said. 20 minutes, maybe 30. If it doesn't work, Georg said, you are exactly where you are now. Richter was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. Georg was already walking back to the Lanz. Let me tell you what Georg Steiner knew about flood ground that Richter's recovery unit did not, because this is the practical truth of what happens next. Flood-affected ground near a riverbank is not soft uniformly. It has structure, areas where bedrock or gravel or consolidated material remains firm despite the water saturation, and areas where clay or silt has become genuinely unstable. The difference is invisible on the surface. It cannot be seen in the color of the soil or the depth of the puddles. It can only be known through specific knowledge of the specific bank, knowledge that comes from years of working on it in all conditions. Richter's recovery vehicles had found the clay. The crane truck alone weighed 18 tons, and its outrigger pads had concentrated that weight into 4 contact points, each putting enormous pressure into the saturated clay. The clay had yielded. It always yielded under that kind of pressure. The Lanz Bulldog weighed just under 2,000 kilograms. Its wide, low-pressure agricultural tires spread that weight across a contact area disproportionately large for the machine's mass. The ground pressure beneath the Lance's tires was comparable to that of a walking man. The gravel ridge Georg knew about, running east from the Old Willow for 30 meters, could support the Lance easily. It could not have supported the crane truck. But there was more. The Lance's single-cylinder engine operated at low RPM. At those RPM, the machine could move at less than 1 kilometer per hour without stalling, the flywheel managing the torque between firing strokes, delivering force steadily rather than in surges. At that speed, the pull on the tanker's front axle would not be a sudden jerk, but a sustained, gradual pressure. The kind that moved a heavy stuck object without the sudden force spikes that could shift the tanker unpredictably toward deeper water. Georg also knew that the Lance's ignition depended on the heated glue kopf rather than electronics. Water did not stop the glue kopf from igniting. The engine had run in rain, in flooded fields, in conditions that would have shorted the systems of newer machines. It would run tonight, in the spray from the river and the continuing rain, because it had been designed before electronics were part of the equation. He had known all of this for 30 years. He had simply never needed to explain it to a rescue unit before. Now subscribe if you have not yet, because what happens on this bank in the next half hour is the reason this story is still told in this valley. He heated the glue kopf for 9 minutes. In the cold and damp of an October evening with rain coming down steadily, and the river noise filling the air and the smell of flood water and wet willow bark, the blowtorch flame was a small, precise, indifferent blue. Georg held it steady against the cast-iron hot bulb chamber at the base of the engine, crouched on the gravel ridge with the river 8 meters away, and the tanker visible in his peripheral vision, tilted, the water around its front axle brown and fast. The rescue team had gathered at a distance. Richter stood apart from his men, watching. The younger man who had spoken earlier was silent now. 9 minutes, the iron reached its color. Georg straightened, set the blowtorch on its bracket, lifted the starting crank. He turned it once. The flywheel moved. He turned it again, his full weight behind the rotation. On the third turn, the engine fired. Pum! The half-second of silence, the night seemed to hold around it. Then pum! The flywheel had its rhythm. Pum, pum, pum. 1 beat per second in the October rain. The exhaust pipe sent its thread of dark smoke into the gray evening air. The Lance shook once and settled. The sound carried across the water and came back from the far bank a half-second later, the sound of a single-cylinder engine and the river and the rain and nothing else. Hans Richter was watching the flywheel. Georg climbed onto the open seat, no cab, no windshield, the rain on his face and his coat's shoulders, and attached the winch cable to the drawbar hook. He checked the angle from the gravel ridge to the tanker's front left toe point. The diagonal was what he had calculated from the farm, pulling toward the east bank, toward the gravel, turning the tanker's nose out of the current rather than fighting the current directly. He engaged the winch. Subscribe, hit the bell, because this is the moment we have been building toward. The cable tightened. Pum, pum, pum. The engine note did not change. The flywheel turned. The river was loud and close, and the rain was coming down without consideration for anyone's opinion about it, and the cable went from slack to taut with the same patient inevitability with which the Lance did everything. Gradually, without drama, without the sudden jerk that would have moved the tanker toward the wrong depth before the angle had time to work. The cable was fully taut for 4 seconds before anything moved. Then the tanker moved. Not much. A rotation of its mass around its rear wheels, the nose swinging east, toward the gravel, the same direction the current wanted to push it, but now controlled, guided, the cable creating the geometry that turned the river's force from an enemy into a partial ally. The front axle lifted fractionally from the river bottom, and found the upstream side of the submerged gravel ridge. Found it, not gravel over clay. Gravel sitting on bedrock, the same bedrock that made the Brenner Ford crossable in normal conditions, now 3 meters from where the tanker had gone in. The tanker driver had been in his cab for 3 hours. He felt the shift. He felt the front axle find something solid. He had been a truck driver for 14 years, and he understood, through the seat and the wheel and the cab floor, what it felt like when his machine made contact with something it could use. He engaged the engine, slowly, in the lowest gear, without spinning a wheel. The tanker moved under its own power. Off the river bottom, off the soft bank, along the gravel ridge that Georg Steiner had known about since 1947, toward the solid ground at the eastern bank, where the rescue vehicles were standing on dry ground, having failed to accomplish what a Lanz Bulldog with a winch and a man who knew the bank had accomplished in 26 minutes. The rescue crew helped guide it in. They worked quickly and professionally once the tanker was moving, positioning themselves on the stable ground, signaling the driver. The tanker cleared the water. It drove up onto the firm bank and stopped. 22,000 liters of heating oil, delivered. Georg disengaged the winch. He coiled the cable onto its drum with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. He did not look at the rescue team. He did not look at Richter. He brought the Lance around and began the drive back along the gravel ridge toward the eastern farm. Pum pum pum. Hans Richter came to him before he left. Georg had stopped the Lance at the edge of the bank track and was checking the winch cable when Richter walked up the gravel ridge. His orange jacket was soaked through at the shoulders. "Steiner," he said. Georg looked up. "The gravel ridge," Richter said. "Under the willow, I could not see it." "No," Georg said. "It does not look like anything from the surface." "How did you know it was there?" Georg set the cable down. He looked at the river, still rising, still brown, still carrying its debris past the ford in the October evening. "My father showed me," he said. "In 1941, he said, stay east of the old willow on a flood bank. The gravel runs from the willow to the ford. He learned it from his father." He looked at Richter. 3 generations of knowing where the ground is. Richter was quiet. "And the machine," he said. "Why not your modern equipment?" "I do not have modern equipment," Georg said. "I have the Lance." He put a hand on it. "It is light enough for the gravel. Your recovery trucks were not." Richter looked at the Lance, at the flywheel still turning with residual inertia, at the wide tires on the gravel, at the open seat with the rain on it. "I should have asked you before I brought the crane truck," he said. "Yes," Georg said. He climbed back onto the seat. "Good evening, Richter." He drove back to the farm, along the river bank track. Pum pum pum. The tanker reached Unterfeld the following morning. The delivery was made. The 4 farms and the village cooperative received their winter fuel supply. Hans Richter filed a notation in his personal operational notes. It said, "Local terrain knowledge critical, consulted too late. Equipment selection must account for substrate conditions not visible from surface. In future operations near river crossings, identify and consult local landowners before deployment." He followed this notation for the remainder of his career. He told the story once, at a training session in 1971, to a group of younger rescue personnel. One of the trainees asked, "Did you go back and thank the farmer?" Richter said, "I went back the following week." He was not interested in thanks. He said the tanker needed to get through, and it got through, and that was the end of it. The trainee said, "What kind of man is that?" Richter thought about it. He said, "The kind that knows his ground." Georg Steiner farmed the eastern bank of the Ammer for another 11 years, until his son Carl took over in 1976. The Lance stayed on the farm. Carl used it for the soft ground tasks, the waterlogged field work, the October mornings when the river was high and the bank near the ford needed to be approached with care. In 1977, a spring flood brought a tractor from the farm upstream down into the Ammer crossing, and Carl Steiner pulled it out with the Lanz in 40 minutes, on the gravel ridge east of the old willow, exactly where his father had told him the ground was firm. The Lanz fired on the third turn of the crank. Pum pum pum. Some knowledge moves through families the way gravel moves under rivers, quietly, without announcement, shaping the surface long after the original event has passed. What Georg Steiner brought to the Brenner Ford on that October evening was not just a tractor with the right tire pressure. It was 3 generations of knowing where one specific river bank was firm, and where it was not, knowledge that had no official record, no map reference, no document of any kind, that existed only because 2 men before him had stood on that bank in flood conditions and paid attention. Old iron carries old knowledge. And when the modern equipment had failed and the rescue unit had called the district office, and the tanker was still moving toward the deeper water, that knowledge was where it had been for 40 years, in a barn on the eastern bank, patient as gravel, waiting to be asked.